A son always wants to please his mother. And Patrick probably wanted to please his mother this time. Why else would he give a confession, be it true or not?
Molly McIntyre encouraged her own son, Patrick, to confess to murder. But was the confession coerced? Welcome back to Court TV. I'm Greg Jarrett. We have been bringing you live coverage of the trial of Patrick McIntyre. He's accused of strangling his former neighbor and setting her apartment on fire to cover up the crime. Now, the court is currently in a lunchtime recess, and we're going to take this opportunity to talk about a recent provocative study conducted by the American Bar Association. 1,000 people were surveyed by telephone in an effort to gauge perceptions of the justice system in America. Now, the poll seems to indicate that many Americans, both white and non-white, feel that the courts do not treat all racial groups equally.
And her son is convicted, a reward for her role in eliciting the confession. That doesn't sit well with some.
What kind of woman would sell her son up the river for $5,000?
The victim's father is more understanding.
I know she's vilified, and people are really shocked that she would go after the reward money, but she's a mother. And, you know, she's a mother.
McIntyre is accused of killing not only Nicole DeMott, but her 16-year-old Cocker Spaniel. That may move some jurors.
They may give him the death penalty just for the dog, you see.
Well, it is true that people feel very passionately about animals. That's an interesting observation. And for more interesting observations, what better place to go than Vero Beach? And what better person to talk to than Beth Karras? Good morning, Beth.
Good morning, Raymond.
Beth, I got to start with this confession issue. Normally, in a trial, a lawyer will attempt to persuade a judge to keep a confession out if he thinks it was obtained in violation of Miranda or some other legal principle. Welcome back to Court TV. My name is Raymond Brown. We're bringing you a murder case from Florida. It's a case with a number of strange dimensions and also a number of dimensions that we're not unaccustomed to, but that are serious. The most important, capital case. If the defendant's convicted, he could face electrocution in Florida's electric chair, known not affectionately as Old Sparky. In addition to that, this defendant faces perhaps one compelling piece of evidence that is very difficult to understand, and that is his confession was elicited after a conversation with his mother, who was a Vero Beach police officer. That has led to a number of human elements that are strange. And then there's the fact that the dog of the victim perished in the fire with the victim, and at least it's been my experience that sometimes animal deaths can move people even to more extreme lengths of anger and passion than human deaths. They're just milling about inside the courtroom. We think they're setting up monitors for some kind of pretrial activity, and the minute they're ready to go, we'll go to Vero Beach. In the meantime, we get to talk to Isabel Kirshner, who's an experienced lawyer here in New York, a former assistant DA, and one of my...
It was a very heinous crime. There was an arson involved. There was a murder or slaying involved. A pet was killed during it, and then what kind of spun from that were the alleged confession, which was prompted by his mother, who's an officer. He used to be an officer with the Vero Beach Police Department.
The crimes with which Patrick McIntyre is charged might seem to be something out of a strange novel or an even weirder fictional TV show, but they are in fact part of the story of a Florida trial that's going to begin today. Good morning. Welcome to Court TV. I'm Raymond Brown. This morning we go live to Vero Beach, Florida as the murder trial of Patrick McIntyre begins. The defendant is accused of breaking into this apartment and strangling his former neighbor, Nicole DeMott, to death. He then allegedly set the apartment on fire, resulting in the death of her dog. While in jail for unrelated charges, McIntyre confessed to killing DeMott and to starting the fire. Now he's in court charged with the crimes ranging from felony cruelty to animals to first-degree murder. Defense attorneys claim their client's mother, a local police officer, forced the murder confession from her son without reading his Miranda rights. Was she acting as a mother or a police officer? Court TV's Beth Karras is at the courthouse, and we'll have a chance to talk to Beth in a few moments. But before we go to sunny Vero Beach, Florida, let's venture down to the Court TV News Center, where, if we're extremely lucky, Dan Broden is standing by to start.
That's right. Bobby Guttridge is living here in Vero Beach. This is where he practices law. He's actually a friend of James Harpring, the defense attorney in this case. And Bobby has some thoughts of his own that he's going to share with us about this case and defending a case such as this. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Guttridge. If you were picking a jury in a case such as this, and I know you're familiar with the facts of the McIntyre case, what would you be looking for in a jury?
Well, I'd be looking for someone who was sympathetic to this kind of defense, especially if you're going to go with this coerced confession or false confession. And I think what you need to do in a case like this is make sure that if that's what's going to be your defense, you're going to go on this coerced confession type defense, you have to really commit to that in the beginning. And you have to voir dire the jurors, the veneer, early on about coerced confessions. And not just about, normal coerced confession, oh, there'll be a coerced confession, what do you think of that? You have to ask them why they might discount a confession. What kind of things might lead them to believe a confession really wasn't a confession, and even try and go into the facts of the case, that this was a son and her mother, and perhaps a son that was disappointed his mother from time to time, and go into the relationship and what had happened in that relationship and why this young man might want to please his mother and might want to tell her anything that she wanted him to say.
It took 5 days, 5 days to pick a jury of 8 men and 4 women, and there's only one alternate. They had to go with just one because they ran out of jurors, and it was going to take another day today to pick that alternate. It would have delayed the case further. But in the jury selection I saw, I didn't see every minute, but quite a bit of it, and in the jury selection that you saw, did you see that type of questioning to find out where these jurors stood on possible false confessions?
Well, I didn't see a clear theme emerge in the case, and I think that's what you have to do in a case like this, is have a clear theme. Now, certainly Mr. Harpring was very charming in what I saw, and he seemed to be doing what you need to do in a case like this and get the jurors to like you and try and get them to look at your client in a better light. And for that part, I think he did very well. But it didn't seem as though, and just the parts I saw and things that I have heard since that, is that he had a clear theme. And it seemingly is emerging that the theme in the case is going to be this coerced confession. And if that is the theme, I think you need to commit to it, and you need to question the jurors. And perhaps it's the most important part of the trial, maybe more important than the cross-examinations, more important than the opening, and certainly more important than the closing, is getting the jurors ready to understand how a confession like this could come about, how this young man might say something that is false and might not mean it, and what he said really wasn't what happened.
Well, I have to tell you that when I was speaking with our anchor this morning before the opening statements, I had to scratch my head when I was asked what the defense is, because I didn't know. I said we have to wait for the opening statements. I didn't know if it was going to be that the confession is false. You cannot believe it. Those are false statements, or simply that it's coerced and thus unreliable. After we heard the openings and we heard that he's arguing unreliable confession, I'm still confused. What does that mean to a jury?
Well, I'm not sure that it means a whole lot to a jury. Saying something is unreliable, number one, is a legal term that I think jurors don't really understand. And plus, it's kind of a straddling the fence. You have to just go ahead and get into it. If you're going to say that this is a bad confession and that's not what it meant and that it's a false confession, you just have to go in there and you got to get into it, and you got to get dirty if that's what you're going to do, and you got to get in there and say this is what the confession is about, and you can't believe it, and there's no other evidence, and the only reason that we're here is because of this false confession, because of this misstatement. I wouldn't even couch it in terms of a confession. That's a legal term. He just made a statement that was incorrect to please his mother, and I think you really got to go hard on that, and you can't use these legal words like unreliable and coerced and even confession.
Now let me move away from the confession, or the statement in the case, to the community. I'd like to get an idea of the effect on the community that this case had when the killing happened in October of 1997.
Well, certainly it's a horrible thing. You know, a community like this, we're a fairly small community. Everybody knows what's going on, and when you have something this tragic take place, certainly the community is watching, and they're horrified, as was I when I read the news of this woman in her home being burned, and the dog, and just the horrific details of this particular case. It's a horrible thing, and I think the community sees it as a horrible thing and somehow wants vindication. Of course, you know, there's always some sunshine in everything, and I think something like this brings the community together. And if we can do something to make this case actually meaningful, I think Mr. Harpering, in a sense, is doing it. He's giving this young man, Patrick McIntyre, a defense. And I can't state how important that is, because everybody wants to say, we need vindication, we need revenge, and I know Mr. D'Amata is not wanting revenge for himself, but I think the community somehow sees the need to get revenge. But I think what we really need is justice, and justice is best served when someone that commits, if he committed the crime at all, but when someone's accused of a crime this horrible, that this person can get justice for himself in the meaning of getting a defense, and a vigorous defense, a defense that doesn't straddle the fence and goes for the heart of the case and tells the ugly story if an ugly story needs to be told, like the fact that the mother is going to get this reward money. And no one's wanting to say that. No one has said that, as far as my knowledge, in the trial, that there's $7,500 reward money. Everyone's steering away from that. I don't think you can steer away from that fact. That's the fact of the case. One of the facts that gives this young man a defense, if the confession is in fact false, if this statement is in fact false, that his mother wanted this money and she got this money. Now, after the fact, she may not have it yet, but certainly she was somewhat motivated, it would seem, or at least someone would bring that up, you would think.
Let me ask you to stand by, because our anchor in New York, Ricky Kleeman, has a question for you. So let me just get the question from her. Ricky? Yeah. Okay, Ricky wants to know whether or not you have any information of why this case wasn't pleaded to a life sentence, since he's already doing life plus 30 years. Do you know if there was any suggestion of a deal?
Well, I don't know. My understanding is that there wasn't a suggestion of a deal, and certainly that is from hearsay. I know Mr. Harpering. We're friendly acquaintances, I guess you would say. I talked to him on occasion. I have a great deal of respect for him. My understanding, however, is that there really wasn't a deal offered. Now, even if there was a deal offered, I think you're in kind of murky waters, because a lot of this case is going to be appealable on the motion to suppress. It seems to be the focus of the argument in the trial, which shouldn't be perhaps, but nevertheless there was a strong motion to suppress this confession. Now, if that in fact comes back on appeal and the confession gets thrown out, you certainly don't want to be in a position where you've given up any rights to that appeal. And I think that you really don't have, you get sort of boxed in a case like this where you have such a good issue, or you believe you have such a good issue, and the young man's doing life plus 30, so he's not really going anywhere, and I think he felt like, well, you know, I've got to roll the dice. And also, I'm not sure that even the prosecution, you get a case where the community is, and the facts are so horrendous that they were even going to offer a deal. You know, and it's the kind of case that sometimes doesn't get a life type deal. They're saying, well, if the facts are as we say it, and I'm not sure that there's any facts that would really warrant the death penalty, but certainly if the facts are as they say it, it seems somewhat unlikely that they would go for a life sentence.
Let me just ask you one last question about the confession. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, that the confession did get suppressed, or it comes back on appeal, and that was an improper ruling to permit the jury to hear it. There's no case without that confession, right? I mean, that is the case.
Well, seemingly that seems to be the case. It certainly seems that the case is incredibly weak if viable at all, that maybe they wouldn't even be able to try it without the confession. It doesn't seem like there's any physical evidence or anything that would really link Mr. McIntyre to this particular crime without the confession. So certainly if they went on appeal and it comes back and they haven't made any sort of statements now, or the case hasn't changed, and the case would seem to be in very dire straits for the prosecution.
Interesting. Well, thanks a lot for your insights, and stand by for a few minutes. I hope that we'll have a chance to talk to you as the case progresses also.
Thanks a lot, Beth.
Thank you. Ricky, back to you now.
I agree with Bobby Guttridge and you. It appears that there is not a lot of evidence here, and certainly doesn't seem sufficient evidence without that confession. So what were some of the high points of evidence today?
Well, it's important to keep in mind that what the prosecution is doing through all of the detail that they're introducing now, especially with the last witness, the arson investigator, who talked about what he found in the house and how, and the meaning, the significance of it. All the ashes around the body indicated debris was around her body, that her body was there before the fire was set. This is all testimony that corroborates the confession. This is all the testimony, the kind of detail we heard today. It's what the prosecution will later argue shows that Patrick McIntyre's confession is to be believed, that it is reliable, that he obviously was speaking the truth, because how would he know to say that he had piled up items around her body, and then in fact the ashes around it indicate that there was a lot of debris around her, and that he tried to drag her body out of the house, but she was too heavy, so he left her there not far from the door and decided to burn the place. I mean, he knew too much detail. All this physical evidence does corroborate his confession, but without the confession, all this physical evidence doesn't tie Patrick McIntyre to the crime. It simply supports what he's saying.
Right. What should we expect tomorrow, Beth?
Well, you know, the prosecution is telling the judge what the next witnesses are, but they're not talking to us. The lawyers are not permitted to talk to us in any detail, not even to tell us the next witnesses. But they will continue to put on some more evidence, some more of the dental testimony linking the dental records of the victim to her.